Colorado Territory, 1872. The wind howled across the valley like a wounded animal, carrying with it the scent of pine and the promise of coming snow. Ethan Vance pulled his coat tighter around his lean frame, squinting against the approaching dusk. At 25, he'd already spent more years than he cared to count riding the open range, drifting from one cattle outfit to another, never staying long enough for anyone to know him beyond his reputation with horses and his quick, sure hand with a lariat. The setting sun cast long shadows across the rolling landscape as Ethan surveyed the distant town of Willow Creek. His gelding, a sturdy buckskin named Copper, shifted beneath him, eager for shelter and feed after the long day's ride. Ethan understood the feeling. His own stomach had been empty since dawn, and the temperature was dropping fast as November tightened its grip on the mountains. "Just a bit further, boy," he murmured, adjusting his worn Stetson. "Then we'll both get what we need." What Ethan needed was work and distance, always distance. The frontier had taught him one unforgiving lesson: attachment meant vulnerability, and vulnerability got men killed. Better to keep moving, to remain untethered and free of the complications that came with putting down roots. His father had died defending a homestead that wasn't worth the blood spilled over it. His mother had withered away from grief shortly after. Since then, Ethan had lived by a simple creed. The only reliable companions were his horse, his gun, and the vast, empty spaces of the West. But winter was coming, and even a lone wolf needed shelter from the storm. Willow Creek appeared unremarkable as Ethan rode down its main street, a collection of wooden buildings, some freshly painted, others weathered by seasons of sun and snow. A general store, a hotel with peeling paint, a saloon where tinny piano notes spilled out into the evening air. Nothing special, but it would do until spring thaw made the mountain passes navigable again. The livery stable stood at the far end of town, its wide doors open to welcome weary travelers. As Ethan approached, he noticed a woman struggling with a large bag of feed. She was young, no more than 22 by his estimation, with honey blonde hair gathered at the nape of her neck, escaped tendrils framing a heart-shaped face. Her dress was simple, practical cotton in a shade of deep blue, and though it was modest, it couldn't hide the graceful curve of her figure as she bent to retrieve the bag that had slipped from her grasp. Ethan dismounted in one fluid motion, crossing the distance between them before he'd fully registered the impulse to help. "Allow me, ma'am," he said, stooping to lift the heavy sack. The woman straightened, startled by his sudden appearance. Her eyes were the clear green of mountain lakes, wide with surprise that quickly transformed into wariness. "Thank you, but I can manage," she replied, her chin lifting with quiet pride. "I don't doubt it," Ethan said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "But my mama raised me not to stand by while a lady works harder than necessary. Where would you like this?" She hesitated, assessing him with a glance that seemed to take in everything from his trail-worn clothes to the well-maintained gun at his hip. Whatever she saw must have reassured her, for she nodded toward the stable interior. "In the feed room, please, second door on the left." Ethan hoisted the bag onto his shoulder and followed her direction, aware of her watching his every move. When he returned, she was stroking Copper's nose, murmuring something too soft for him to hear. The sight stirred something unexpected in his chest, a flicker of warmth he quickly dismissed. "Fine horse," she observed. "Morgan Cross." Ethan nodded, impressed by her eye. "Good blood in him, gets me where I need to go without complaint." "And where might that be?" she asked, stepping back from Copper. "Wherever there's work to be had," Ethan replied, then added with a hint of formality, "Ethan Vance, ma'am, looking for winter employment if you know of any." "Sophia Owens," she returned. "And as it happens, Mr. Vance, I do." The words hung between them, unexpected and laden with possibility. Ethan noted the lack of a ring on her finger, the confident set of her shoulders, the way her gaze met his directly, unusual for a young, unmarried woman in these parts. "This is my stable," she continued. "My husband built it before he passed last winter. I've been running it since, but with the snow coming," she glanced toward the darkening sky, "I could use a strong back and someone who knows horses. Room and board plus fair wages." Ethan's instinct was to decline. Staying in one place meant forming connections, and connections were dangerous. But the approaching winter limited his options, and there was something in Sophia Owens' direct gaze that challenged him. "Your husband," he said carefully, "he hasn't been gone long." 14 months, she replied, a shadow crossing her features. Pneumonia took him quickly, too quickly for proper goodbyes. Ethan nodded, understanding more than he wished to about abrupt departures from this life. People might talk, young widow hiring a stranger. A flash of something, defiance perhaps, sparked in her green eyes. People already talk, Mr. Vance. I'm a woman running a business in a town where some think I should have sold everything and remarried by now. One more thing for them to gossip about won't make much difference. Her frankness surprised him. Most women he'd encountered in small frontier towns were careful of appearances, bound by the strict social codes that governed life in these isolated communities. Sophia Owens seemed different, practical in a way that spoke of hard lessons learned. Fair enough, he said. I'll take the job, Mrs. Owens, until spring at least. Miss, she corrected him. I was never comfortable with Mrs. I'm Sophia to most in town. Sophia then, Ethan agreed, the name feeling strangely intimate on his tongue. And so it began, a temporary arrangement born of practical necessity. Ethan told himself it was nothing more than shelter for the winter, a pause in his perpetual journey through the vast wilderness of the West. He would work hard, keep to himself, and ride out when the mountain passes cleared. The frontier had no place for permanence in a man's life. That was the truth he'd learned at the cost of everything he'd once loved. One season in Willow Creek wouldn't change that, but fate had other plans. The first snow came 3 days after Ethan's arrival, blanketing Willow Creek in pristine white that transformed the modest town into something from a children's story. Ethan rose before dawn, as was his habit, to tend to the horses before Sophia arrived. He found her already there, lantern light casting a golden glow around her as she moved between the stalls, speaking softly to each animal. "You're up early," he observed, stamping snow from his boots. Sophia glanced up, a small smile touching her lips. "I could say the same for you. I thought cowboys valued their sleep." "Some might. I've always preferred watching the world wake up." Ethan hung his coat on a peg near the door and reached for a pitchfork. The quiet helps a man think. "And what does Ethan Vance think about in the quiet hours?" she asked, continuing her rounds. The question caught him off guard. Few people inquired about his thoughts, fewer still would receive an honest answer. But there was something about the pre-dawn stillness and Sophia's straightforward manner that loosened his tongue. "The trail ahead mostly, where spring might take me. Always looking forward then, never back." Ethan paused, the pitchfork suspended midair. Back doesn't serve much purpose except to remind a man of his mistakes. Sophia considered this, her head tilted slightly. Or his joys, his lessons, the people who shaped him. "Not much joy in my rear view, Miss Sophia." The words came out before he could stop them, more revealing than he'd intended. She nodded as if he'd confirmed something she'd already suspected. "Well, that makes 2 of us, I suppose, though I try to remember the good parts alongside the hardships." They worked in companionable silence after that, falling into a rhythm that felt surprisingly natural for 2 strangers. By the time the sun had fully risen, casting diamond-bright reflections off the snow, they had completed the morning chores and were sharing coffee in the small office attached to the stable. "How did you come to own this place?" Ethan asked, warming his hands around the tin cup. "Most women in your position would have sold after their husband passed." Sophia's gaze drifted to the window, where the town was coming to life despite the snow. "Daniel, my husband, he built this stable with his own hands, every board, every nail. He had dreams of raising horses someday, not just boarding them." A wistful smile touched her lips. "When he died, everyone expected me to sell, to go back east to my family or find another husband quickly. But this was our dream, not just his. I couldn't let it go. It can't be easy, running a business like this alone." "Nothing worth having comes easy, Mr. Vance," she replied, meeting his eyes directly. "The frontier teaches that lesson quickly, doesn't it? But I'm not completely alone. I have friends in town, and now I have help for the winter." There was something in her steady gaze that made Ethan acutely aware of himself in a way he rarely experienced. He was used to being overlooked, to blending into the background of saloons and cattle camps. Sophia Owens saw him, not just his capable hands or his ability with horses, but something deeper. It was unsettling. And yet he couldn't look away. The moment was broken by the sound of the stable door opening. a man's voice called out, "Sophia, you in here, darlin'." Ethan noticed the slight stiffening of Sophia's shoulders before she rose, composing her features into a polite smile. In the office, Sheriff Cole. The man who appeared in the doorway was tall and broad-shouldered, with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to authority. His badge gleamed against his dark coat, and his smile revealed teeth too perfect for a frontier lawman. "Thought I'd check on you after the snowfall," he said, barely acknowledging Ethan's presence. "Roads are getting treacherous, might need to think about stocking up on supplies." "I'm well prepared, thank you," Sophia replied, her tone cordial but cool. "Sheriff Cole, this is Ethan Vance. He's helping me with the stable through winter." Cole's assessing gaze swept over Ethan, taking in the worn but well-maintained clothing, the calloused hands, the quiet alertness that marked experienced frontiersmen. "Passing through?" he asked, the question carrying more weight than its simplicity suggested. "For the season," Ethan replied evenly, then likely moving on. Something like satisfaction flickered across the sheriff's features. "Well, Willow Creek is a peaceful town. We like to keep it that way. Any trouble in your past I should know about?" Before Ethan could respond, Sophia stepped forward. "If I had concerns about Mr. Vance's character, Sheriff, I wouldn't have hired him. Now, was there something specific you needed this morning? We have work waiting." Cole's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Just being neighborly, Sophia. Someone has to look out for your interests, with you being alone and all." "I appreciate the thought," she said firmly, "but I'm quite capable of managing my own interests." After the sheriff departed, a tension lingered in the small office. Ethan watched as Sophia busied herself with paperwork, her movements slightly more abrupt than before. "He fancies himself your protector," Ethan observed quietly. Sophia looked up, a flash of irritation crossing her features. "Sheriff Cole fancies himself many things, Mr. Vance, my future husband among them, despite my clear lack of interest." "Persistent man." "Insufferably so," she sighed, setting down her pencil. "He was Daniel's friend, or so he claimed. Started calling more frequently after the funeral, bringing food, offering help around the place." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "His assistance always comes with expectations I'm not willing to meet." Ethan nodded, understanding the situation all too clearly. A young, attractive widow was vulnerable in frontier towns, where women were outnumbered and marriage was often as much about survival as affection. That Sophia had maintained her independence spoke volumes about her strength of character. "Well," he said, rising to his feet, "we have that delivery of hay coming from the Peterson farm. I should clear the path to the storage barn." Sophia gave him a grateful look, recognizing his deliberate return to practical matters. "Yes, thank you, and Mr. Vance." He paused at the door, glancing back. "I'm glad you're here," she said simply. 3 words, ordinary, commonplace, yet they settled in Ethan's chest with unexpected weight. He nodded once and stepped out into the snow, telling himself the warmth he felt was merely the contrast to the biting cold air. But deep down, in places he rarely examined, Ethan Vance knew better. As November gave way to December, Ethan settled into a routine that felt dangerously close to belonging. Each morning began with stable chores alongside Sophia, followed by whatever work needed doing, repairing loose boards, tending to horses brought in for shoeing, delivering freight that arrived on the stagecoach for townsfolk who lived outside Willow Creek's boundaries. The town itself began to feel familiar, its rhythms and residents becoming known to him. There was Doc Wilson, gruff but kind-hearted, who stopped by the stable regularly to check on Sophia though she showed no signs of illness. Mrs. Hargrove at the general store, whose sharp eyes missed nothing and whose gossip Ethan carefully avoided. Young Timothy at the telegraph office, barely 16 but responsible for the town's connection to the outside world. And then there was Sophia herself, the greatest danger to Ethan's carefully maintained distance. She was unlike any woman he'd encountered in his years of drifting. Her grief for her husband was evident in quiet moments when she thought herself unobserved, but it hadn't diminished her. Instead, it seemed to have refined her, burning away any softness that might have existed before and leaving behind a core of resilience that Ethan found himself admiring more with each passing day. They worked well together, anticipating each other's movements in the close quarters of the stable. sharing meals in the small apartment above where Sophia lived while Ethan stayed in a modest room attached to the barn. Their conversations gradually deepened beyond the practicalities of running the stable, though Ethan remained guarded about his past. It was during one of the worst blizzards of December, with wind howling around the eaves and snow piling against the doors, that something shifted between them. They had spent the evening in Sophia's small sitting room, where a pot-bellied stove provided blessed warmth against the frigid night. Ethan had been mending harness leather while Sophia worked on the account books, the silence between them comfortable rather than strained. "Tell me something true about yourself, Ethan Vance," Sophia said suddenly, looking up from her figures. Ethan's hands stilled on the leather. "What would you like to know?" "Something no one else knows, something you carry with you on the trail." She set aside her pencil, giving him her full attention. The lamplight caught the gold highlights in her honey-blonde hair, creating a halo effect that made her look younger than her 22 years. "That's a heavy request for a casual evening," he replied, buying time. Sophia smiled, the expression warming her green eyes. "Is it? I think the storm makes it appropriate. When the world is locked away by snow and darkness, truths come easier." She hesitated, then added, "I'll trade you a truth of mine for one of yours." The offer hung between them, tempting in its simplicity. Ethan knew he should decline, maintain the barriers that had kept him safe for years, but the howling wind and the warmth of the room created an intimacy that weakened his resolve. "I was engaged once," he said finally, the words rusty from disuse. "Back in Missouri before the war, her name was Caroline." Sophia's expression remained open, encouraging. "What happened?" "Raiders came through our town in '63, bushwhackers under Quantrill's command." Even after nearly a decade, the memory tightened his throat. "I was away, scouting for the Union forces. When I returned, there wasn't much left. Caroline, my parents are home, all gone." Understanding dawned in Sophia's eyes, along with genuine sorrow. "So you left Missouri?" "There was nothing to stay for," Ethan confirmed. "Headed west and kept going, never saw much reason to stop until now." The last words slipped out unbidden, more revealing than he'd intended. Sophia absorbed this, her gaze steady on his face. "I think I understand now why you live as you do, always moving forward, never looking back." "Your turn," Ethan said, eager to shift attention away from himself. "A truth for a truth." She drew a deep breath, her fingers tracing patterns on the tablecloth. "I never loved my husband, not in the way stories tell of love, at least." The confession surprised him. Then why marry him? "Daniel was kind and steady. My father had died, leaving my mother and sisters in difficult circumstances. Daniel offered security, respectability." Sophia's voice held no bitterness, only a contemplative quality. "He was 15 years older than me, but gentle. He never demanded what I couldn't give. We were companions, I suppose, partners in building something together." "Do you regret it, marrying without love?" She considered the question carefully. "No, Daniel gave me freedom I wouldn't have had otherwise, to leave Virginia, to start fresh somewhere my family name didn't carry expectations. He taught me about horses, about business. And he left me this place which has become more home than anywhere else I've lived." Her eyes met Ethan's directly. "But sometimes I wonder what it would be like to feel that thing poets write about. To have your heart race at someone's touch, to miss them when they're gone like a physical ache." The air between them seemed to thicken, charged with unspoken possibilities. Ethan was acutely aware of Sophia's presence across the small table, the slight flush on her cheeks, the way the lamplight caught the curve of her neck where a single strand of hair had escaped her simple updo. "I should check on the horses," he said abruptly, rising to his feet. "Storm like this makes them nervous." If Sophia was disappointed by his retreat, she didn't show it, of course. "Take the lantern, it's pitch black out there." Ethan nodded, grateful for her understanding. He needed distance, needed the cold shock of winter air to clear his head of dangerous thoughts. Thoughts about how Sophia's laugh made something long dormant stir in his chest, how her strength and vulnerability, existing side by side, drew him like a moth to flame. The snow was falling heavily as he made his way to the stable, the lantern casting eerie shadows across the white landscape. Inside, the horses nickered softly at his appearance, seemingly untroubled by the storm. Ethan moved among them, checking water buckets and patting velvet noses, trying to quiet the tumult of his thoughts. He had come to Willow Creek seeking only shelter from winter's fury. Instead, he'd found something far more dangerous, the possibility of attachment, of putting down roots in soil that might once again be ripped away. The frontier was no place for permanence. Ethan had learned that lesson in blood and ashes. He couldn't forget it, no matter how compelling the widow with eyes like mountain lakes might be. But as he stood in the quiet stable, listening to the storm rage outside, Ethan Vance faced an uncomfortable truth. For the first time in years, he was reluctant to think about moving on when spring arrived. Christmas approached, bringing with it a festive spirit that transformed Willow Creek. Garlands of pine decorated storefronts and red ribbons brightened doorways. The small church at the end of Main Street organized a community celebration, and despite his inclination to avoid such gatherings, Ethan found himself escorting Sophia to the event. "You look," he began, words failing him as she descended the stairs from her apartment. Her dress was deep green velvet, modest yet flattering, with a cream-colored shawl draped over her shoulders. Her honey-blonde hair was arranged in an elegant knot, with soft tendrils framing her face. Sophia smiled, a hint of shyness in her expression that was unlike her usual confidence. "Presentable, I hope." "Beautiful," Ethan said honestly. "Every man at that party will envy me for walking in with you." A flush crept up her neck at the compliment. "Thank you, you clean up rather well yourself, Mr. Vance." Ethan had made an effort, borrowing Doc Wilson's razor for a proper shave and wearing his one decent shirt, freshly laundered. His coat had seen better days, but it was clean and well-brushed. He offered his arm, suddenly feeling like the raw young man he'd been before war and loss had hardened him. "Shall we, Miss Sophia?" The church hall was transformed with evergreen boughs and candles, the scent of pine and spiced cider filling the air. A small band played traditional tunes and tables groaned under the weight of food brought by townspeople. As they entered, Ethan felt the weight of curious glances. Though he'd been in Willow Creek for nearly 2 months, he'd kept largely to himself, interacting with townsfolk only when necessary for stable business. Now, arriving with Sophia on his arm, he was making a statement he hadn't fully considered. "Sophia, how lovely you look," Mrs. Hargrove called, approaching with a calculating gleam in her eye. "And Mr. Vance, what a pleasant surprise. We thought you might be one of those solitary types who avoid civilization whenever possible." "Just busy with the stable, ma'am," Ethan replied politely. "Miss Sophia keeps a full schedule for me." "I'm sure she does," the older woman said with a knowing look that made Sophia stiffen slightly beside him, "though surely not on Sundays. I don't believe we've seen either of you at services since you arrived, Mr. Vance." Before Ethan could formulate a diplomatic response, Sheriff Cole appeared at their small group, his gaze fixed on Sophia with undisguised appreciation. "You're a vision tonight," he said, ignoring Ethan completely. "Save a dance for me." "Good evening, Sheriff," Sophia replied evenly. "You remember Mr. Vance." Cole's smile didn't reach his eyes as he finally acknowledged Ethan with a curt nod. "Vance settling in, I see." "Just escorting Miss Sophia to the festivities," Ethan said, keeping his tone neutral despite the instant dislike that sparked between them. "As her employee." Something like triumph flashed across Cole's features at the word employee. He turned back to Sophia. "Well, I hope your employee won't mind if I steal you away for a dance or two. It is Christmas, after all." Sophia's hand tightened almost imperceptibly on Ethan's arm. "Actually, I promised my first dance to Mr. Vance. But perhaps later, Sheriff." The band struck up a lively reel, and Ethan found himself being guided toward the makeshift dance floor, Sophia's expression resolute. "I don't recall promising me a dance," he murmured, amused despite himself. "Would you rather I danced with Sheriff Cole?" she countered, arching an eyebrow. "Not particularly." Ethan placed a hand at her waist as they took their positions in the line of dancers. "Though I should warn you, I'm out of practice." "Just follow my lead," Sophia replied with a smile that warmed him more effectively than the crowded room. As it happened, the steps returned to Ethan more easily than expected. They moved together through the patterns of the dance, and he found himself enjoying the simple pleasure of holding Sophia's hand, seeing the color in her cheeks deepen as they twirled. For a few precious minutes, the weight of the past lifted, and Ethan allowed himself to simply be a man dancing with a beautiful woman on a winter's night. When the music ended, they were both slightly breathless. Ethan reluctantly released her hand, already missing the connection. "You dance well for a cowboy," Sophia said, her green eyes bright with enjoyment. "My mother insisted all her children learn." "Said it was the mark of civilization," he replied, memories of happier times surfacing unexpectedly. They made their way to the refreshment table, where Doc Wilson handed them cups of hot cider. The older man studied them with shrewd eyes above his spectacles. "You're good for her," he said quietly to Ethan while Sophia was distracted by a greeting from the mayor's wife. "Haven't seen her smile like that since before Daniel fell ill." Ethan shifted uncomfortably. "We have a business arrangement, Doc." "Nothing more." The doctor snorted, "And I'm Queen Victoria. Listen, young man, I've known Sophia since she arrived in Willow Creek as a new bride. She deserves happiness after what she's been through." "I'm not staying," Ethan said, the words tasting bitter on his tongue. "Come spring, I'll move on. That's how it's always been." Doc Wilson regarded him thoughtfully. "Plans change, people change. Sometimes a man finds something worth staying for." Before Ethan could respond, a commotion near the entrance drew everyone's attention. A man burst into the hall, snow dusting his shoulders and hat, his expression urgent. "Doc, you're needed at the Peterson place. The baby's coming early and there's complications." Doc Wilson was already moving, setting down his cup and reaching for his coat. "How early?" "6 weeks or so, Martha says, and it's breech." The doctor cursed under his breath. "In this weather, it's a 2-hour ride in good conditions." "The pass is nearly blocked with snow," the messenger confirmed grimly. "I barely made it through myself." Ethan stepped forward. "Doc, I know a route through the hills that can cut the journey by half. Used it hunting last month." Doc Wilson looked at him sharply. "You willing to guide me?" "Could be dangerous in the dark with this storm." "I'll come too," Sophia said, already gathering her shawl. "Martha will need another woman there." Sheriff Cole moved to intercept her. "Don't be foolish, Sophia. It's no night for a lady to be out. Let the men handle this." "Martha Peterson is my friend," she replied firmly, "and I've assisted with difficult births before. Doc can use the help." Within 20 minutes, they had gathered supplies and saddled horses. Ethan had changed back into his work clothes and sturdy coat, while Sophia had swapped her fine dress for practical riding attire that raised a few eyebrows among the townsfolk who had gathered to see them off. "Stay close," Ethan instructed as they set out, the wind whipping snow into their faces. "The path gets narrow in places and visibility is poor." The journey was grueling. Even with Ethan's shortcut, they fought against deepening snow and treacherous footing. Twice, Doc Wilson's horse nearly lost its balance on the steep trail, and Ethan's respect for Sophia grew as she navigated the difficult conditions without complaint, her face set with determination. The Peterson homestead appeared like a mirage through the swirling snow, a sturdy cabin with light spilling from its windows. Inside, they found chaos. Martha Peterson lay in the bedroom, her face contorted with pain, while her husband paced anxiously in the main room, their 2 young children huddled fearfully by the fire. Doc Wilson took charge immediately, with Sophia assisting. Ethan was relegated to the main room with Mr. Peterson and the children, keeping the fire built up and distracting the little ones from their mother's cries with improvised stories about his travels. Hours passed, the storm outside intensified, rattling the cabin's windows and howling around its eaves. Inside, the atmosphere was tense with waiting, punctuated by Martha's labor pains and the doctor's calm instructions to Sophia. Near dawn, a new sound pierced the night, the thin wail of a newborn baby. Ethan exchanged a relieved glance with Peterson, who sagged against the wall in palpable relief. The children, who had finally fallen asleep, stirred at the noise. Doc Wilson emerged from the bedroom, his sleeves rolled up, an expression weary but satisfied. Mother and daughter both doing well, considering it was touch and go for a while, but they're fighters. He looked directly at Ethan. "We wouldn't have made it in time without your shortcut. That baby would have died, and possibly Martha too." The simple statement settled heavily on Ethan's shoulders, not as a burden but as something else entirely. Something that felt dangerously like purpose. Sophia appeared a few minutes later, cradling a tiny bundle wrapped in clean flannel. The sight of her holding the infant, her face soft with wonder despite her obvious exhaustion, created a longing in Ethan so acute it was almost physical pain. "Would you like to see her?" Sophia asked, approaching where he sat by the fire. "She's small but perfect." Before he could object, Sophia was placing the newborn in his arms. Ethan froze, terrified of his own calloused hands against something so fragile. The baby's face was red and wrinkled, her head covered in dark fuzz, and she weighed almost nothing against his chest. "Support her head," Sophia murmured, adjusting his hold with gentle hands. "There, you're a natural." Ethan looked down at the tiny life he cradled and felt something crack inside him, some wall he'd built years ago to protect himself from precisely this kind of vulnerability. The baby's eyes opened briefly, unfocused and dark blue, before closing again in sleep. "They're naming her Hope," Sophia said softly. "Appropriate for a child born on Christmas morning, don't you think?" Ethan could only nod, words beyond him in that moment. When he finally looked up, he found Sophia watching him with an expression that mirrored his own inner turmoil, wonder mixed with fear, longing tempered by caution. They returned to Willow Creek later that day, the storm having passed and left a transformed landscape in its wake. Pristine snow covered every surface, and the air held that peculiar stillness that follows great tumult. As they rode side by side, Ethan found himself seeing the beauty around him with new eyes, not as obstacles to be overcome, but as wonders to be appreciated. "Thank you," Sophia said as they approached the stable. "For last night, your knowledge saved 2 lives." "You were the brave one," Ethan replied honestly. "Most women I know would have stayed in town where it was safe." She smiled, snowflakes catching in her eyelashes. "Perhaps I'm not like most women you know." "No," Ethan agreed, something shifting irrevocably inside him. "You most certainly are not." January brought bitter cold and growing complications. The night of the birth had altered something fundamental between Ethan and Sophia, creating an awareness that neither seemed ready to acknowledge openly. They worked alongside each other as before, but now every accidental touch, every shared glance carried weight. Ethan found himself noticing details he'd previously overlooked: the graceful arc of Sophia's neck as she bent over account books, the way she hummed softly to herself while working with the horses, the surprising depth of her laugh on the rare occasions he managed to amuse her. More dangerous still, he found himself sharing more of himself than he had with anyone in years. Stories of his childhood in Missouri, his brief time scouting for Union forces, even occasional mentions of Caroline, though those memories had lost some of their sharp edges. Sophia, in turn, revealed more of her own history, her upbringing in Virginia as the daughter of a once prominent family reduced to genteel poverty after the war, her marriage to Daniel as much a practical arrangement as an emotional one, her dreams of breeding horses once the stable was firmly established. "You should do it," Ethan told her one evening as they sat by the fire, reviewing the stable's ledgers. "Start your breeding program come spring. You have the knowledge and the facility." "It takes capital," Sophia replied practically. "More than I have available right now." "You could take on a partner, someone with experience and a bit of money set aside." The words emerged before Ethan fully considered their implications. Sophia looked up sharply, studying his face. "Are you offering Mr. Vance?" Ethan hesitated, caught between instinct and inclination. "Just thinking aloud," he said finally, retreating to safer ground. "You'd have no shortage of interested parties if you put the word out." Something like disappointment flickered in Sophia's eyes before she nodded, returning her attention to the ledger. "Perhaps, though finding someone who shares my vision might prove challenging." The moment passed, but it left Ethan unsettled. For the first time in years, he was considering a future beyond the next season, the next cattle drive. It was dangerous thinking, the kind that led to vulnerability, to loss, yet he couldn't help himself. In quiet moments, he found himself imagining what it might be like to stay in Willow Creek, to build something lasting with Sophia. To wake each morning with purpose beyond simple survival. These thoughts were interrupted one bitter January afternoon by the arrival of 3 rough-looking men on trail-worn horses. Ethan was repairing a fence in the corral when they rode up, their manner setting off immediate warnings in his experienced assessment. The leader was a tall man with a scar running down his left cheek and cold eyes that evaluated everything with calculating precision. His companions were equally hard-looking, one bull-necked and silent, the other thin and nervous, with constantly moving hands. "Afternoon," the scarred man called, "looking for stabling for our mounts and a place to wait out this cold snap." Ethan straightened, casually positioning himself between the strangers and the stable entrance where Sophia was working. "We have room, $3 a day per horse, including feed." The man's eyebrows rose, steep price for a backwater town. "Quality care costs," Ethan replied evenly. "There's a cheaper livery in Carbondale, 15 miles south, if you prefer." The scarred man studied him for a long moment, then shrugged. "3 days should do it. We're expecting to meet associates before moving on." He dismounted with fluid grace that spoke of a life spent in the saddle. "Name's Wade. These are my brothers, Lester and Finn." Brothers they might claim to be, but Ethan doubted any blood connection. He'd encountered enough outlaw gangs to recognize the dynamic, the leader, the muscle, and the fidgety one who was usually quick with a knife. "Ethan Vance," he responded, offering no more information than necessary. "I'll show you where to put your horses." As the men followed him into the stable, Sophia looked up from the tack she was repairing, her expression becoming carefully neutral as she assessed the newcomers. "Miss Sophia Owens owns this establishment," Ethan said by way of introduction. "I work for her." Wade's gaze lingered on Sophia with an interest that made Ethan's jaw tighten. "Ma'am. Fine place you have here." "Thank you," Sophia replied coolly. "Mr. Vance will see to your horses. The hotel is 2 buildings down if you need accommodations." "Much obliged," Wade tipped his hat with exaggerated courtesy before turning to his companions. "Unload the saddlebags, boys. Don't want to leave our personal items in the cold." Ethan noted how carefully they handled those bags, and how Wade carried his own rather than entrusting it to the others. Whatever they contained, it wasn't merely trail supplies. After the men departed for the hotel, Sophia approached Ethan, her voice low. "I don't like them." "Wise instinct," he replied, checking that the strangers were out of earshot. "Those aren't ordinary travelers. Outlaws." Ethan nodded, almost certainly. "The question is whether they're just passing through or have business in Willow Creek." Sophia's expression grew troubled. "Should we alert Sheriff Cole?" "Not yet. Let me keep an eye on them first." Ethan hesitated, then added, "I'd feel better if you stayed with Mrs. Hargrove until they move on, just as a precaution." "This is my business, Ethan. I'm not abandoning it because of 3 suspicious characters." "Sophia." No, her tone brooked no argument. "I've dealt with difficult men before, will be cautious, but I won't be driven from my own property by fear." Ethan recognized the stubborn set of her jaw and knew further discussion was pointless. "Then we take turns watching and you keep your father's shotgun close, and no one is ever alone in the stable while they're here." She agreed to these conditions, though Ethan could tell she thought he was being overprotective. Perhaps he was. But something about Wade and his brothers had triggered all his survival instincts, the same instincts that had kept him alive through years of drifting through lawless territories. His concerns proved justified the following day when he overheard Wade and Finn in quiet but intense conversation while retrieving something from their saddlebags. Ethan was mucking out a stall nearby, positioned to appear busy while remaining alert. "Bank closes at 3, Wade was saying. "Teller leaves by the back door with the keys. Simple job if everyone plays their part." "What about the sheriff?" Finn asked, his hands moving nervously as always. "Lester will keep him occupied. 1 flash of gold is all it takes to get most lawmen looking the other way." Ethan kept his head down, processing the fragments of conversation. A bank robbery, then, planned for the near future. The Willow Creek Bank wasn't large, but it served as a repository for much of the area's wealth, ranchers' savings, merchants' profits, the payroll for the lumber camp outside town. He needed to warn Sophia and decide on a course of action. If he approached Sheriff Cole directly, there was no guarantee the lawman would believe the word of a drifter over 3 strangers, especially with no concrete evidence. And if Cole was as corruptible as Wade suggested, the warning might even backfire. As Ethan moved to leave the stable, Wade appeared suddenly in his path, expression neutral but eyes sharp with suspicion. "Finished with your chores, Vance?" "Just taking a break," Ethan replied easily. Miss Sophia keeps me busy. Wade studied him, and Ethan had the distinct impression of being evaluated as a potential threat. You been with her long? Few months. Just winter employment. Pretty young thing to be running a place like this alone, Wade observed, his tone casual but intent clear. No husband in the picture. Widowed, Ethan said shortly. And not interested in changing that status, from what I've seen. Wade chuckled, the sound without humor. Every woman has her price, Vance. Question is whether it's money, security, or something more. Persuasive. The implied threat hung in the air between them. Ethan maintained an outward calm while calculating how quickly he could reach the knife in his boot if necessary. Miss Sophia sets her own terms, he said flatly. Men who forget that tend to regret it. Wade's eyes narrowed fractionally before he stepped aside. Good to know where loyalties lie in this town. Very informative. Ethan found Sophia in the feed room, counting sacks of oats. He closed the door behind him before speaking in a low voice. They're planning to rob the bank soon, from the sound of it. Sophia's eyes widened, but to her credit, she didn't gasp or otherwise react dramatically. You're certain? Heard it from their own mouths. They think they can bribe Cole to look the other way. Can they? Ethan hesitated. I don't know him well enough to say, but we can't take that chance. Sophia considered this, her practical nature asserting itself. We need to warn the bank manager, Mr. Hollister. He's honest to a fault. He'll take precautions without raising alarm. I'll speak to him, Ethan decided, less suspicious than you suddenly expressing concern about security. Be careful, Sophia said, touching his arm briefly. Wade doesn't strike me as someone who leaves loose ends. The warmth of her fingers lingered on Ethan's sleeve long after he'd left to find Hollister. The bank manager was initially skeptical of Ethan's warning, but years of frontier caution won out over doubt. He agreed to move the majority of the bank's cash to his home safe and to vary his routine for the coming days. Whether these precautions would be sufficient remained to be seen. That evening, as Ethan kept watch from the hayloft window overlooking the street, he observed Wade and his companions in deep conversation outside the saloon. Their expressions were tense, suggesting their plans weren't proceeding smoothly. Ethan had positioned himself to remain unseen while maintaining a clear view of the main street. He didn't notice Sophia's approach until she was beside him, a steaming cup of coffee in her extended hand. Thought you could use this, she said quietly. It's getting colder. Ethan accepted the cup gratefully, his fingers brushing hers in the exchange. Thanks, you should be inside where it's warm. And miss all the excitement, she settled beside him, wrapping her shawl more tightly around her shoulders. Have they moved yet? Just talking, but something's bothering them. Hollister must have changed the routine enough to make them nervous. Sophia nodded, her profile illuminated by the faint light from the street lanterns. She was beautiful in the half-light, her features softened but her strength still evident in the set of her jaw. Ethan found himself wanting to reach out, to touch the curve of her cheek, to feel the silk of her hair between his fingers. The thought startled him with its intensity. This wasn't the abstract appreciation he'd allowed himself before. This was specific, immediate desire, dangerous territory for a man who'd sworn never to form attachments again. What happens after? Sophia asked suddenly. After what? After they leave one way or another, after winter ends. She turned to face him, her green eyes searching his in the dim light. What happens to us, Ethan? The question hung between them, laden with unspoken possibilities. Ethan felt the walls he'd built around himself wavering, crumbling under the steady gaze of this remarkable woman who'd somehow slipped past his defenses. I don't know, he admitted, the truth painful but necessary. I've been running so long, I'm not sure I remember how to stay in one place. What are you running from? Her voice was gentle, without judgment. The memories of what you lost in Missouri. Partly, Ethan stared out at the darkened street, finding it easier to speak when not facing her directly. But mostly from the fear of losing again. Every time I've cared about something, someone, it's been taken from me, my family, Caroline, the farm I was raised on. He swallowed hard. After a while, a man learns not to get attached. It's safer that way. Safer perhaps, but is it living? Sophia's hand found his in the darkness, her fingers warm against his. I was married for 3 years to a good man I didn't love because I was too afraid to seek what I truly wanted. Now I find myself wondering if I'm making the same mistake again, letting fear dictate my choices. Ethan turned to her, his heart hammering in his chest. What do you truly want, Sophia? Their eyes held in the darkness, the question suspended between them like a fragile bridge. Before she could answer, a sharp whistle from the street below broke the moment. Wade and his companions were on the move, heading not toward the bank as expected, but in the direction of the stable. They're coming here, Ethan said, rising quickly to his feet. Get inside and lock the door. I'll deal with them. Sophia stood as well, her expression resolute. This is my property, Ethan. We'll face them together. Before he could argue, they heard the stable door open below, followed by the sound of boots on packed earth. Ethan motioned for silence, then led the way down the ladder from the hayloft, moving with the quiet precision of a man accustomed to dangerous situations. They found Wade alone in the main aisle, examining the tack room door with obvious interest in its lock. Something you need, Mr. Wade, Sophia called, her voice steady despite the tension evident in her posture. The man turned, unsurprised by their appearance. His hand rested casually near his holstered revolver. Just checking on my horse, ma'am. Thought I heard him fussing. Your horse is fine, Ethan said flatly. And the tack room is locked for the night. Wade's smile didn't reach his eyes. Cautious folks, aren't you? Must have valuable items to protect so carefully. Just good business practice, Sophia replied. Now, if there's nothing else, we were about to retire for the evening. Actually, there is something else. Wade's expression hardened. Your friend Vance here has been interfering in matters that don't concern him. Had a little chat with Hollister this afternoon, didn't you? Ethan tensed, calculating the distance to his own weapon. Bank manager and I discussed the weather, cold spell coming. Cold indeed. Wade's hand moved to his gun with practiced ease. Change of plans, unfortunately. We'll be leaving town tonight instead of tomorrow, with compensation for our troubles. You won't find much cash here, Sophia said calmly, though Ethan could see the fear she was masking. Weekly deposits already went to the bank. Oh, I think you have something more valuable than cash. Wade's gaze swept over Sophia in a way that made Ethan's blood boil. A fine-looking widow with a prosperous business might fetch a good price in certain territories, or provide pleasant company on a long journey. Ethan stepped forward, positioning himself between Wade and Sophia. That's not happening. Take your horses and ride out, and we'll forget this conversation occurred. Wade laughed, the sound echoing in the quiet stable. Bold words from a man at a disadvantage, Lester. Finn. The expected backup didn't materialize, and confusion flickered across Wade's face. Your friends won't be joining us, came a new voice from the stable entrance. Sheriff Cole stood framed in the doorway, his revolver drawn and pointed steadily at Wade. They're enjoying the hospitality of my jail cell at the moment. Wade's expression darkened. Should have known a backwater sheriff couldn't be bought as easily as promised. Not all men are for sale, Cole replied, advancing slowly into the stable, especially when it comes to protecting their town. His gaze flickered briefly to Sophia, a wealth of meaning in the glance. What happened next unfolded in seconds. Wade, recognizing his position was deteriorating rapidly, drew his weapon with lightning speed, aiming not at Cole but at Sophia. Ethan reacted instinctively, lunging forward and tackling her to the ground as a shot rang out. Pain exploded in his shoulder, hot and immediate. He heard Sophia cry out beneath him, felt her hands steadying him as he rolled to one side. More shots followed, Cole returning fire. Then silence, broken only by the frightened whinnies of horses and Sophia's voice urgent in his ear. Ethan, where are you hit? Let me see. He tried to focus through the haze of pain. Shoulder, I think, not bad. That was a lie. It felt plenty bad, a burning agony that radiated down his arm and across his chest, but he'd survived worse. Sheriff Cole appeared in his field of vision, looking grimly satisfied. Wade won't be troubling anyone again. Bullet caught him square in the chest. He knelt beside Ethan, examining the wound with experienced eyes. Clean through the shoulder, painful but not fatal if infection doesn't set in. I'll tend to him, Sophia said firmly, her hand gentle on Ethan's uninjured shoulder. Doc Wilson taught me enough for this. Cole nodded, seemingly unsurprised by her capability. I'll send the doc over once he's checked on Wade, just to be safe. He hesitated, then added with reluctant respect, good thing you had Vance here, Sophia. Man didn't hesitate to put himself between you and danger. Ethan tried to rise, found the world spinning alarmingly, and subsided as Sophia pressed him gently back down. Stay still, she ordered, her voice betraying more emotion than her composed features. You've lost blood. The next hours passed in a blur of pain and disjointed awareness. Ethan remembered being moved to Sophia's apartment above the stable, remembered Doc Wilson's gruff kindness as he cleaned and bandaged the wound, remembered Sophia's cool hand on his forehead when fever set in during the night. Most of all, he remembered her voice, sometimes reading aloud from one of her books, sometimes simply talking about ordinary things, plans for the stable, memories of her childhood, dreams for the future. Her voice became his anchor, tethering him to consciousness when pain threatened to pull him under. On the third day, the fever broke. Ethan awoke to find himself in Sophia's bed, sunlight streaming through partially drawn curtains. His shoulder throbbed dully, but the fiery agony had subsided to manageable discomfort. Sophia was asleep in a chair beside the bed, her head at an awkward angle that would surely leave her neck stiff. She looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes suggesting she'd kept vigil through most of his illness. Ethan studied her in the quiet moment, the honey-blonde hair escaping its pins, the gentle rise and fall of her chest with each breath, the strength evident even in repose. Something expanded in his chest that had nothing to do with his injury and everything to do with the woman before him. As if sensing his regard, Sophia stirred, her eyes opening and immediately finding his. Relief washed over her features, followed by a smile that transformed her weariness into radiance. You're awake, she said, moving to sit on the edge of the bed. Her hand found his, fingers intertwining naturally. How do you feel? Like I've been kicked by a particularly angry mule, Ethan replied honestly. But I'll live. Yes, you will, her voice caught slightly. Doc says you were lucky, the bullet missed anything vital. Ethan squeezed her hand gently. Seems I have a talent for survival. You also have a talent for scaring me half to death. The words were light, but her expression was serious. When I saw you fall when there was so much blood, she trailed off, swallowing hard. I'm sorry for frightening you, Ethan said softly. Don't you dare apologize for saving my life. Sophia's green eyes were bright with unshed tears. But if you ever do something so reckless again, I'll. You'll what? He prompted when she hesitated. I don't know, something terrible. A smile quirked her lips despite her attempt at sternness. I'm not accustomed to people putting themselves in harm's way for me. Get used to it, Ethan said before he could reconsider the implications of his words. Sophia's eyes widened slightly, hope and wariness battling in her expression. What does that mean, Ethan? It was time for truth, the kind he'd been avoiding since the first day he rode into Willow Creek. It means I don't want to leave when spring comes. It means that for the first time in years, I'm more afraid of riding away than I am of staying. And what are you afraid of finding if you stay? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Everything I've been running from, he admitted. Attachment, vulnerability, the chance to lose someone I care about deeply. And if that someone feels the same way, Sophia's fingers tightened around his. If she's equally terrified but unwilling to let fear dictate her future any longer. The air between them seemed charged with possibility, with futures neither had dared imagine before. Ethan reached up with his good arm, his hand cradling the curve of Sophia's cheek as he had wanted to do for weeks. Then I would say we're both taking a considerable risk, he murmured. But perhaps some risks are worth taking. Sophia leaned into his touch, her eyes never leaving his. I've never been one to shy away from a worthwhile gamble, Mr. Vance. Their first kiss was gentle, mindful of Ethan's injury, yet containing all the longing that had built between them over the winter months. When they parted, Sophia rested her forehead against his, a soft laugh escaping her. This wasn't how I imagined our first kiss, she confessed. You half conscious in my bed after being shot by an outlaw. No. How did you imagine it then? Ethan asked, savoring the newfound freedom to ask such questions. A blush colored her cheeks. Perhaps in the stable at sunset after a day's work well done, or by the fire on a snowy evening. Somewhere romantic and ordinary all at once. We have time for those kisses too, Ethan promised, if you're certain this is what you want. Sophia drew back slightly, her expression growing serious. I want you, Ethan Vance. Not just for the winter, not just until you heal. I want the difficult days and the joyful ones. I want to build something lasting together. The words resonated through Ethan like a physical force, breaking the last of the barriers he'd constructed around his heart. I've spent years believing the frontier was no place for love. That attachment only led to pain. You've proven me wrong at every turn. As have you, she replied softly. I thought I'd accepted a life of practical arrangements and modest contentment. You showed me there can be more even here, even now. Outside, the January cold continued its grip on Willow Creek, but within the small apartment above the stable, something new had taken root, something that promised to bloom with the coming spring and endure long after. By April, the snow had retreated to the highest peaks and the valley bloomed with wildflowers. Ethan's shoulder had healed cleanly, though it ached in cold weather, a reminder of how close he'd come to losing everything just as he found it. The stable flourished under their joint care. Word of Sophia's dreams to breed quality horses had spread, and several local ranchers had expressed interest in partnerships. Sheriff Cole had accepted Ethan's presence with grudging respect after the incident with Wade, though the lawman clearly nursed lingering feelings for Sophia that he was gentleman enough to keep private. On a warm spring evening, Ethan stood in the corral, watching Sophia exercise a spirited mare they'd recently acquired. She rode with natural grace, her honey-blonde hair catching the sunset's golden light. She'd grown even more beautiful to him in the months since his injury, not just in appearance but in the thousand small moments of courage, kindness, and determination he witnessed daily. As she brought the mare to a halt beside him, cheeks flushed with exertion and pleasure, Ethan reached up to help her dismount. His hands lingered at her waist and she smiled down at him. What do you think? She asked. Worth the investment. Definitely, he replied, though his eyes never left hers. She'll produce magnificent foals with the right stallion. Sophia dismounted in a fluid motion, remaining within the circle of his arms. And what else might be worth investing in, Mr. Vance? Ethan felt the weight of the small box in his pocket, a simple ring he'd commissioned from the silversmith in Carbondale, set with a green stone that reminded him of Sophia's eyes. I had thought to wait for a more dramatic moment, he said, suddenly nervous in a way gunfighters and outlaws had never made him. But looking at you now, I can't think of a better time or place. Sophia's eyes widened as he withdrew the box and opened it, revealing the ring gleaming in the evening light. Sophia Owens, you found me when I was determined not to be found. You offered shelter when I believed I needed none. Most importantly, you taught me that a man can survive loss and still find the courage to love again. Ethan took her hand, his voice steady despite the thundering of his heart. I'm asking you to be my wife, to build a life and a future here together. Tears spilled onto Sophia's cheeks, but her smile was radiant. Yes, she whispered, 1,000 times yes. The ring slid onto her finger, as if made for her hand alone. When Ethan rose from his knee, Sophia threw her arms around his neck, mindful of his still tender shoulder, and kissed him with all the passion and promise of their shared future. Behind them, the mare nickered softly, as if offering her own approval of the match. Ethan laughed against Sophia's lips, feeling lighter than he had in years, perhaps lighter than he ever had. What shall we call our venture? He asked as they walked hand in hand toward the stable, the mare following placidly behind. Every proper horse breeding operation needs a name. Sophia considered this, leaning into his side. How about Second Chance Ranch? It seems fitting given our history. Perfect, Ethan agreed, thinking how far he'd come from the lonely drifter who rode into Willow Creek, seeking only temporary shelter from winter's fury. He had found so much more, a home, a purpose, and most precious of all, a love that had healed wounds he'd thought would pain him forever. The frontier had taken much from Ethan Vance, but in Sophia Owens it had given back more than he'd ever dared to hope for. As the stars appeared one by one above their small corner of the Colorado Territory, Ethan and Sophia stood together in the doorway of the stable that would become the heart of their shared enterprise. Tomorrow would bring wedding plans, business decisions, and all the ordinary challenges of building a life together in the still Wild West. But tonight, in this moment, they were simply two people who had found in each other the courage to believe in second chances, against all odds that fate had placed in their way.